policy lessons from South Korea's development. Managing dominance of conglomerates and increasing growth potential of small and medium-sized enterprises with In-mi Kim.
Hello, my name is In-mi Kim, and I'm professor and dean at the Graduate School of International Studies at EWHA Women's University in Seoul, South Korea. Today, I would like to talk about South Korea's chaebol, the family-owned and managed and controlled large business groups. There are Samsung, LG, SK, and Hyundai Motor, which are globally recognized brand names. So my presentation today will ask 3 questions. What are the key characteristics of the chaebol, and how did they become so dominant in South Korea's economy? Should South Korea rebalance the country's industrial organization from chaebol dominance to a more balanced structure with small and medium-sized enterprises? What is South Korea doing to transition to a more knowledge and service-based economy? Let me start with this question. Can you survive one day without using a product or service provided by the chaebol if you live in South Korea? You may find it nearly impossible even for one day. A typical South Korean would wake to the alarm of a Samsung smartphone, brush your teeth with LG toothpaste, watch an LG TV, eat a quick bowl of ready-made rice of CJ food products, drive a Hyundai motor car to work or take the subway made by Daewoo Motors, have lunch at a nearby Lotte department store's basement food court, have coffee at Starbucks brought into South Korea by Shinsegae Foods, and on and on. Even if you live in the most remote corners of South Korea, it would be impossible to live a day without the chaebol. The fascinating story about the South Korean chaebol is that they have become globally leading producers of semiconductors, smartphones, automobiles, iron and steel, ships, and on and on. They are the engine of South Korea's rise from rags to riches, yet they are criticized for their family succession, lack of transparency in management, excessive concentration of wealth vis-a-vis small and medium-sized enterprises. So what is a chaebol? First, the chaebol is a family-owned and family-managed and controlled large business groups. The founder's family is still in control of the largest chaebol. Mr. Chung Ju-young, who was the founder of Hyundai Chaebol, was famous for his charismatic family management. Every morning at 5 a.m., his sons would come to his house for a humble breakfast, and they would all march to the Hyundai headquarters at 6 a.m. No one was excused unless they were out of the country on a business trip. The family is at the core of South Korea's leading chaebol, even though they have become globally competitive businesses. Second, the actual ownership by the founding family has decreased over time, but through a complex holding system, the founding family exerts tremendous control over the chaebol management, going beyond the mere ownership of stocks. Third, the chaebol have an extraordinary wide range of businesses. Unlike business groups in the United States or other countries where they focus on a core business, the chaebol are known for their wide diversification, from light manufacturing such as food products and textiles to heavy and chemical industries including automobiles, electronics, iron and steel, oil refinery, semiconductors and ships, to services including construction, financial services, hotels, ICT, retail, to name a few. Without exception, the chaebol have expanded their businesses to a large number of unrelated businesses. Let's look at some basic facts about the largest 5 chaebol. Samsung is one of the oldest chaebol in South Korea, with the first member firm founded in 1938 by Lee Byung-chul as a trading company. He then started manufacturing sugar, textile, and flour. Lee has built a business empire with light manufactured products, but later expanded into electronics. Interestingly, he inherited the family business to his third son, Lee Gun-hee, which is unusual in South Korea's primogeniture culture. Nonetheless, founder Lee picked his third son, whom he thought had the best business entrepreneurship. Lee succeeded the chairmanship upon his father's death in 1987, and in 1993 he made his famous speech in Frankfurt at his Chaebol-wide CEO meeting. Disappointed at the lackluster performance of Samsung and the relatively high rate of defectives in the electronic products, he ordered that, quote, "You should change everything. The only exception should be your wife and children. But you must change in order to survive in the global marketplace. You cannot become the first-tier company unless you change and reduce the deficiency rate to zero," was the gist of his speech. 2 years later, he made headlines again by burning nearly $15 million worth of cell phones which were found to be defective. Soon thereafter, Samsung began to change dramatically. It is now no longer a second or third tier company, but produces high-end electronics from semiconductors to smartphones with global market shares in the top 5 for these products. Note that the current chairman of the leading Chaebol are sons and grandsons of the founders who continue to show a very strong family presence in management. It is not always a peaceful transition to the second or third generation. The Hyundai Group broke off to more than 3 business groups into Hyundai Motor, Hyundai Heavy Industries, and Hyundai Construction. The Samsung Group broke off into Samsung, Shinsegae, CJ, and Hansol groups. The LG Group broke off into LG, LS, and GS groups, and the Lotte Group is going through changes as we speak. These top Chaebol are major export producers and have become global companies. Samsung Electronics of the Samsung Chaebol ranked 13 in the Fortune Global 500 in 2015. They all have a large number of member firms, but in highly diversified businesses. Let's look at the dominance of the top Chaebol in the South Korean economy. Let's look at the dominance in their market. The total assets of the top 4 Chaebol account for over 57% of the GDP in 2012. In terms of total sales of the top 10, they account for more than 71.6% of the top 51 large business groups in 2013. In terms of export growth of the top 10, 24.07% of growth were accounted for by these top 10 Chaebol. So how did they become so dominant in South Korea? We cannot talk about Chaebol dominance without the relationship with the developmental state. The developmental state in South Korea led the country's economic development since the 1960s. For the developmental state, economic development is top priority of the government, and it provides leadership in long-term comprehensive development planning for the economy. It picks the winning industries, disciplines the private sector through performance-based credit, industrial licenses, government repayment guarantees, tax breaks, and also in resources, the most important being capital and technology, and also market access, sometimes providing near monopoly for some domestic markets. It is not an invisible hand, but a developmental state is a very visible and powerful driver of economic development. In South Korea, the developmental state picked the large private businesses for light manufacturing-based exports in the early 1960s. In the 1970s, the developmental state picked the Chaebol. The Chaebol firms have accelerated their growth into Fortune Global 500 firms. In 2006, 7 firms in the top 14 large business groups were in the Fortune Global 500. That number grew very rapidly, and 13 out of the 14 largest business groups have at least one Fortune Global 500 firm. So what should we do in the 21st century to help transform the South Korean economy from manufacturing to service and knowledge-based economy? We're working in the context of a relatively limited state intervention compared to the 20th century when the developmental state intervened very heavily in the economy. We're also working in the context of weak, small and medium-sized enterprises vis-a-vis the super Chaebol. In terms of a number of corporations, we see that the Chaebol account for only 0.1% of the total number of firms, while the small and medium-sized enterprises account for 99.9% of the number of firms, with over 3.5 million firms. In terms of number of workers, the chaebol account for only 12.1%, while the SMEs account for over 87.9% of number of workers. The South Korean economy is dominated by the chaebol firms by their share in GDP, export, wage levels, and R&D. The chaebol account for 64% of total South Korean exports. The wage of SME workers have gone down steadily compared to that of the chaebol workers, from 73.5% in 1993 to 52.5% in 2014. But can we sustain the current growth path of knowledge-based economy without the SMEs? What can we do to help the transition toward a service and knowledge-based economy? If you look at the nature of services and knowledge-based economy, it is where knowledge is at the center and creativity is at the center. This does not necessarily come from a large business group's laboratory with a fixed hierarchy of management and research employees. Perhaps a startup could provide more fertile ground for innovation and creativity. Does South Korea have a chaebol firm that can foster such thinking outside of the box mentality or creativity? What about the competition between Samsung Electronics and Apple? Where does the change come from? No longer from the hardware, but more importantly, from the software. Where can South Korea's next leading edge come from? We should be looking for synergy between a top-down and bottom-up process. In the past, we're accustomed to a top-down process where the government led the process by showing leadership in strategic planning and provision of incentives, removing excessive regulations. But now we must also focus on bottom-up processes with the private sector engagement. Private sector should be engaged in a large share of the nation's R&D and services related to the knowledge-based economy. Here, the chaebol and SMEs must play a big role. The chaebol must be much more active in engaging the SMEs to be more fully engaged in the knowledge-based economy. The small and medium-sized enterprises should try to find more independence from the chaebol and become a vibrant member for the knowledge-based economy. What are the future challenges for engaging the small and medium-sized enterprises for the knowledge-based economy? For the government, containing the unchecked growth of the chaebol, providing subsidies and support for some small and medium-sized enterprises, including R&D, capital, and market. For the chaebol, it's looking for synergy with small and medium-sized enterprises through partnerships and support for startups. For small and medium-sized enterprises, they should be looking for survival without the chaebol, perhaps through investment in R&D and global partnerships.